Welcome to Dreamic, a place where stories gently carry you into the night. Tonight, we travel back more than 2,000 years to a world of marble cities, curious minds, and one man whose ideas would quietly shape the future of humanity. His name was Aristotle. He did not conquer kingdoms or command armies, yet his thoughts would outlive empires. He asked simple questions about nature, truth, and what it means to live a good life. And in searching for those answers, he changed the way the world thinks. So settle in, relax, and let the story begin. Long before Aristotle was born, the Greek world was already restless with questions. By the 4th century BCE, Greece was not a unified nation, but a mosaic of fiercely independent city-states, each with its own laws, customs, and ambitions. Among them, Athens stood as the intellectual heart of the ancient world, a place where ideas were debated as passionately as wars were fought elsewhere. Here, words carried power, and thought itself could shape destiny. Greek society was alive with argument. In public squares, philosophers, politicians, poets, and ordinary citizens gathered to debate justice, truth, virtue, and the nature of reality. Democracy, still a fragile experiment, demanded participation, persuasion, and reason. To speak well was to wield influence. To think clearly was to survive politically. Ideas were not abstract luxuries, they were tools of power. Yet this world of thought was deeply unsettled. Philosophy was still young, searching for its identity. Thinkers like Thales, Heraclitus, and Pythagoras had begun to look beyond myth, asking whether the universe followed patterns and laws, rather than the unpredictable will of gods. Some believed everything was made of water, others of fire, others of numbers. Their insights were bold but fragmented. Each philosopher explained a piece of reality, yet no one had yet created a system capable of holding all knowledge together. Science, as we understand it today, did not yet exist. Observation and experimentation were rare and inconsistent. Nature was still explained largely through stories, storms caused by angry gods, disease by divine punishment, fate by cosmic design. Even as reason advanced, mythology remained deeply woven into everyday life. Temples stood beside schools. Oracles spoke alongside scholars. Rational inquiry and ancient belief lived side by side, often in tension. Athens reflected this contradiction perfectly. In the same city where Socrates challenged citizens to examine their beliefs, playwrights staged tragedies in which gods intervened mercilessly in human affairs. Logic questioned tradition, while tradition resisted logic. Knowledge expanded, but without structure. Ideas multiplied faster than they could be organized. The Greek mind was awakening, but it lacked a framework to guide it. Beyond Athens, other city-states wrestled with similar challenges. Sparta valued discipline and strength over philosophy, yet relied on reason to maintain its rigid system. Macedonia arose in the north, combining military ambition with growing cultural influence. Across the Aegean, trade routes carried ideas from Egypt, Persia, and Mesopotamia, exposing Greece to astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and ancient wisdom from older civilizations. The world was becoming larger and more confusing. As information spread, so did contradiction. Philosophers argued fiercely over what could truly be known. Some claimed that change was an illusion. Others insisted that nothing remained the same. Skeptics questioned whether truth itself was even possible. Without agreed methods of reasoning, debates often led not to clarity but to deeper uncertainty. This intellectual chaos created both excitement and danger. Without reliable ways to distinguish truth from persuasion, clever rhetoric could overpower honest reasoning. Leaders learned to manipulate crowds through emotion rather than logic. Sophists, professional teachers of argument, trained students to win debates regardless of truth. In this environment, knowledge risked becoming a weapon rather than a guide. Greece needed more than brilliant ideas. It needed order. It needed a mind capable of observing the natural world carefully, questioning assumptions rigorously, and organizing knowledge into a system that could endure. A thinker who could bridge myth and reason, theory and observation, ethics and science. Someone who could ask not only what we think, but how we should think. The conditions were perfect for such a figure to emerge. War, politics, cultural exchange, and intellectual rivalry pushed Greek society to its limits. Old explanations no longer satisfied new questions. The gods felt distant, tradition felt insufficient. The hunger for understanding grew sharper with each generation. This was a civilization standing at a crossroads, looking backward to myth and forward to reason, unsure which path would lead to truth. It is within this charged atmosphere that Aristotle would eventually step onto the stage of history. But before his voice could bring structure, the world had to feel the full weight of disorder. Before logic could be built, confusion had to be recognized. Before science could be defined, nature had to be questioned. Greece before Aristotle was not ignorant, it was overflowing. Overflowing with ideas, arguments, and possibilities, yet lacking a unifying framework. It was a world asking questions faster than it could answer them. And in that restless space between belief and knowledge, myth and reason, chaos and clarity, the need for a new kind of thinker became unavoidable. The stage was set. In the quiet northern town of Stagira, far from the crowded debates of Athens, Aristotle is born into a world shaped not by politics or rhetoric, but by nature, medicine, and careful observation. Stagira sits near forests, rivers, and the Aegean coast, an environment alive with movement, life, and change. From his earliest days, Aristotle grows up not surrounded by myths alone, but by the physical realities of the living world. His father, Nicomachus, serves as a court physician to the Macedonian royal family. This role proves decisive. In ancient Greece, medicine is not magic or prayer. It is observation. Physicians study the body, track symptoms, compare cases, and search for natural causes. Young Aristotle watches this process closely. He sees how careful attention, not superstition, leads to understanding. Healing does not come from divine favor alone, but from knowledge of how the body works. This lesson stays with him for life. Unlike many children of his era, Aristotle is exposed early to questions about anatomy, health, and nature. He hears discussions about balance in the body, the effects of diet, the importance of environment. These conversations quietly shape his thinking. Knowledge, he learns, comes from looking closely at the world as it is, not as we imagine it to be. After the early loss of his parents, Aristotle is raised by a guardian, but his curiosity never fades. He spends long hours observing plants, animals, and landscapes. He notices patterns, how animals move differently, how seasons affect growth, how water shapes land over time. These are not idle observations, they are questions forming silently in his mind. Why does nature behave this way? What rules govern life? While other children learn myths explaining the world through gods and heroes, Aristotle listens, but he also watches. He does not reject myth outright, but he does not stop there. Stories are interesting, but they do not explain enough. He wants causes, not just meanings. This instinct separates him early. Education in Aristotle's youth focuses on poetry, music, and basic philosophy. He learns Homer as all educated Greeks do. He studies language and memory. But unlike many students, he's less drawn to performance and more to understanding structure. How is knowledge built? How do facts connect? Why do some explanations endure while others collapse? These questions slowly define his identity. At around 17, Aristotle leaves Stagira for Athens, the intellectual center of the Greek world. Yet even before arriving there, his approach is already distinct. He does not arrive as a blank slate. He brings with him a habit of careful observation, a respect for empirical evidence, and a belief that nature itself holds answers waiting to be discovered. This belief challenges much of Greek philosophy at the time. Many thinkers argue that true knowledge exists beyond the physical world, that senses deceive and only abstract reason leads to truth. Aristotle, shaped by medicine and nature, quietly disagrees. He believes that the senses are not obstacles to knowledge, but its starting point. To understand anything, one must first observe it carefully. Nature, he believes, is not chaos, it is organized. This conviction grows stronger as he matures. He begins to see that living things follow patterns, that change has causes, and that nothing happens without reason. Even before formal training, Aristotle is already forming the foundation of what will later become his philosophy. Knowledge begins with experience, and understanding comes from organizing what we observe. Stagira, though small, gives him something Athens cannot at first: space to watch without distraction. The rhythms of rural life allow him to notice details others overlook. Birds, plants, weather, and animals become silent teachers. They do not speak, but they demonstrate. This early immersion in the natural world explains much about Aristotle's future work. While other philosophers focus on ideals, Aristotle will focus on life itself. While others search for truth beyond the physical world, he will search within it. His early years teach him that reality is not something to escape, it is something to study. By the time he sets foot in Athens, Aristotle is no longer simply a student seeking instruction. He is a young thinker, carrying a method shaped by experience. Observe first, reason second, conclude carefully. The seeds planted in Stagira, through medicine, nature, and quiet curiosity, will grow into a philosophy that reshapes science, logic, ethics, and human understanding for more than 2,000 years. Before Aristotle becomes a teacher, a logician, or a philosopher, he is first a careful observer of the world, and that beginning makes all the difference. When Aristotle arrives in Athens, he steps into a city unlike any he has known before. Athens is loud with argument, alive of ambition, and fueled by ideas. Marble buildings rise beside open courtyards where thinkers gather not to trade goods, but to trade thoughts. At the heart of this intellectual world stands the Academy, the school founded by Plato, already regarded as the greatest philosopher of his age. For the young Aristotle, the Academy is both intimidating and irresistible. Here, philosophy is not a private pursuit, but a shared discipline. Students walk and talk as they debate ethics, politics, mathematics, and the nature of reality itself. Plato teaches that the visible world is only a shadow of a higher, perfect realm of forms, eternal truths that exist beyond physical experience. According to him, what we see is imperfect and unreliable. True knowledge belongs to the realm of pure reason. Aristotle listens carefully. For nearly 20 years he studies under Plato, absorbing his teacher's brilliance and discipline. He learns to argue rigorously, define terms precisely, and search for universal truths. Plato's influence shapes Aristotle deeply. He comes to understand the power of abstract thinking, the importance of definitions, and the necessity of logical structure. Yet, even as he learns, he begins to question. Unlike many students who accept Plato's ideas with devotion, Aristotle cannot ignore a growing discomfort. Plato looks upward toward ideals beyond the physical world. Aristotle looks outward toward the world itself. He respects Plato profoundly, but something does not sit right with him. How, he wonders, can we understand truth if we dismiss the very world we experience? The tension is subtle at first, then unmistakable. Aristotle notices that Plato often begins with conclusions rather than observations. The forms explain everything, but are never directly seen, measured, or tested. Aristotle, shaped by nature and medicine, feels that knowledge must begin with what is observable. For him, the physical world is not an illusion, it is the foundation of understanding. This difference is not rebellion, it is evolution. Within the academy, Aristotle becomes known for his sharp mind and relentless questioning. He debates respectfully but persistently. He challenges assumptions, asks for clarity, and pushes ideas to their limits. Plato reportedly calls him the mind of the school, recognizing his brilliance even as they disagree. Their relationship is complex, part mentorship, part rivalry. Plato values contemplation and ideal perfection. Aristotle values classification, cause, and function. One seeks truth beyond nature, the other seeks truth within it. Together, they represent two complementary forces of human thought, abstraction and observation. But history will show that Aristotle's turn toward the empirical world marks a decisive shift. During his years at the academy, Aristotle begins to develop his own methods. He studies biology, categorizes animals, examines political systems, and analyzes language. While Plato's dialogues focus on philosophical ideals, Aristotle's interests spread across disciplines. He is not content with one domain of knowledge. He wants to understand everything, and to understand it systematically. This ambition sets him apart. The academy is a place of ideas, but Aristotle begins to imagine a place of investigation. He envisions philosophy not as pure speculation, but as a structured inquiry grounded in evidence. Knowledge, he believes, must be built step by step, from observation to reasoning to conclusion. Over time, the philosophical gap between teacher and student becomes too wide to ignore. When Plato dies, Aristotle does not inherit the academy. His ideas no longer align fully with its direction. Rather than continue within Plato's framework, Aristotle chooses a new path. This decision is not a rejection of Plato, but a declaration of independence, a commitment to a different way of thinking. It is one of the most important intellectual turning points in human history. From Plato, Aristotle learns how to think. From his own instincts, he learns how to think differently. The synthesis of these influences produces something entirely new, a philosophy rooted in logic, evidence, and the natural world. The academy gives Aristotle tools. His questioning gives him direction. By the time he leaves Athens, Aristotle is no longer simply a student of philosophy. He is becoming its architect, ready to build a system of thought capable of organizing knowledge itself. What begins as respectful disagreement will soon reshape science, logic, ethics, and education for centuries to come. The student has learned from the master, but he is now ready to challenge the world. As Aristotle moves beyond the academy and begins to define his own intellectual path, a single problem dominates his thinking. Human knowledge is scattered, inconsistent, and unreliable without structure. Ideas exist everywhere, in politics, nature, ethics, language, but there is no universal method to test whether those ideas are true. Arguments rise and fall based on persuasion rather than accuracy. Opinions clash endlessly, and certainty remains elusive. Aristotle decides that before humanity can understand the world, it must first understand how thinking itself works. This realization leads to one of the most revolutionary moments in intellectual history, the birth of formal logic. Aristotle does not see logic as philosophy's ornament, but as its foundation. Without rules for reasoning, he believes, no discipline, science, ethics, or politics can claim truth. Knowledge must be organized, evaluated, and verified through consistent principles. He begins by observing how people argue. Some arguments feel convincing but collapse in their scrutiny. Others appear simple yet prove unshakable. Aristotle studies these patterns carefully, not to win debates, but to understand what makes reasoning valid. From this investigation emerges the concept of the syllogism, a structured form of argument that links premises to conclusions through necessity rather than persuasion. A classic example illustrates his insight. All humans are mortal. Socrates is human. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. To Aristotle, this is not merely clever phrasing. It is a demonstration of logical certainty. If the premises are true and the structure is correct, the conclusion must be true. No emotion, authority, or rhetoric can change that outcome. Truth becomes something that can be tested, not declared. This idea transforms human thinking. Aristotle realizes that logic is not about content, but about form. The same logical structure can apply to biology, ethics, law, or mathematics. Once reasoning is formalized, errors can be identified and corrected systematically. For the first time, humanity possesses a tool to separate valid conclusions from flawed thinking. But Aristotle does not stop at syllogisms. He introduces categories, fundamental ways of describing reality, such as substance, quantity, quality, relation, time, and place. These categories provide a framework for organizing knowledge itself. By classifying what exists and how it can be described, Aristotle gives thinkers a shared language for inquiry. Chaos begins to yield clarity. Chaos begins to form patterns. This approach reshapes philosophy into a disciplined investigation rather than poetic speculation. Aristotle also defines principles that remain essential today. The law of non-contradiction, which states that something cannot be both true and false in the same sense at the same time. Though simple, this idea becomes the bedrock of rational thought. Without it, discussion collapses into meaninglessness. With it, debate becomes productive. What makes Aristotle's logic extraordinary is its universality. He does not design it for philosophers alone. He designs it for anyone seeking truth. Lawmakers can test arguments, scientists can evaluate hypotheses, teachers can structure knowledge, courts can reason consistently. Even ordinary people gain a method to think clearly in daily life. For Aristotle, logic is not abstract, it is practical. He believes that reason is humanity's defining feature. Animals perceive, humans understand. Logic is the tool that turns perception into knowledge. Through it, humans rise above instinct and habit, becoming capable of deliberate thought and ethical judgment. This belief shapes his entire worldview. Aristotle does not separate logic from ethics or politics. A just society, he argues, depends on sound reasoning. Bad logic produces bad laws. Confused thinking leads to tyranny, superstition, and error. Clear reasoning, by contrast, creates balance, fairness, and wisdom. In this sense, logic becomes a moral force. Yet Aristotle is aware of logic's limits. Logic alone cannot supply knowledge. It must be paired with observation. Reason organizes facts. It does not replace them. This balance between empirical evidence and rational structure becomes the hallmark of his philosophy and the foundation of the scientific methods centuries later. Remarkably, Aristotle's system of logic remains dominant for nearly 2,000 years. Medieval scholars teach it. Renaissance thinkers revive it. Modern education still relies on its core principles. Though new forms of logic eventually emerge, Aristotle's framework remains the starting point, the grammar of rational thought. Through this achievement, Aristotle does something unprecedented. He gives humanity the ability to examine its own thinking. In organizing knowledge, he organizes the human mind itself. Ideas become tools rather than weapons. Disagreement becomes investigation rather than conflict. Truth becomes something to discover, not impose. With logic, Aristotle builds the invisible architecture that supports science, philosophy, law, and education to this day. Before him, humans asked questions. After him, they learned how to answer them. And in doing so, he forever changes how civilization thinks. After organizing how humans should think, Aristotle turns his attention outward, to the living world itself. For him, nature is not a mystery explained by gods or myths, but a system governed by patterns, causes, and purposes that can be understood through careful observation. This shift marks a revolutionary moment in human history, the beginning of science as a disciplined study of the natural world. In Aristotle's time, most explanations of nature rely on tradition, poetry, or divine intervention. Thunder is the voice of the gods. Disease is punishment. Animals exist without systematic study. Aristotle rejects this approach quietly but firmly. He believes that nature speaks for itself if one is patient enough to watch and listen. Observation becomes his guiding principle. Rather than speculating from a distance, Aristotle studies animals directly. He dissects fish, examines insects, observes birds, and records the behavior of mammals. He watches how creatures move, eat, reproduce, and die. Nothing is too small or ordinary to matter. A worm crawling through soil deserves the same attention as a lion on the hunt. This mindset is unprecedented. Aristotle begins classifying life, grouping animals by shared characteristics such as blood, reproduction, habitat, and movement. He distinguishes between animals with backbones and those without, laying the groundwork for biological taxonomy. Though his classifications are imperfect by modern standards, the method behind them is revolutionary. Systematic comparison based on evidence. For Aristotle, biology is not a curiosity. It is a window into universal truth. He believes that every living thing has a purpose, what he calls a final cause. A bird's wings exist for flight. Teeth exist for chewing. Roots exist to draw nourishment. Nature, in his view, does nothing without reason. This belief does not come from theology, but from observation. Structures match functions. Patterns repeat. From this emerges a powerful idea. Nature is intelligible. Aristotle extends this thinking beyond biology into physics, the study of motion and change. He examines why objects move, fall, or remain at rest. He studies growth, decay, heat, cold, and transformation. Change, he argues, is not random. It follows principles. Everything moves from potential to actuality, from what it could be to what it becomes. Though later science will revise many of his conclusions, Aristotle's approach reshapes human inquiry. He insists that knowledge must begin with the senses. We see first, we touch, we compare. Only then do we reason. This stands in sharp contrast to thinkers who believe truth exists independently of experience. Aristotle does not deny reason, but he roots it firmly in observation. This balance becomes the foundation of the scientific method. Aristotle also studies causality, asking not just what happens, but why. He identifies four causes: material, what something is made of; formal, its structure; efficient, what brings it into being; and final, its purpose. This framework allows complex phenomena to be analyzed systematically rather than mystically. In doing so, Aristotle gives humanity a language for explaining the world. Nature, once terrifying and unknowable, becomes approachable. It can be studied, understood, and taught. Knowledge is no longer the privilege of priests or poets. It becomes the work of observers. Importantly, Aristotle does not see humans as separate from nature. He places humanity within the natural order, subject to the same principles as plants and animals. Humans are unique not because they defy nature, but because they possess reason. This idea humbles humanity while elevating responsibility. To understand nature is to understand ourselves. Aristotle's scientific work is vast, spanning zoology, botany, meteorology, and embryology. He writes detailed accounts of animal reproduction, growth, and behavior. Many of his observations are astonishingly accurate, surviving centuries of scrutiny. Yet his greatest contribution is not any single discovery, it is the method itself. By insisting on careful observation, classification, and explanation, Aristotle creates a template for science. Later thinkers, from medieval scholars to Renaissance scientists, will rely on his approach, even when they challenge his conclusions. In this way, Aristotle becomes the bridge between myth and method. Nature is no longer explained by stories, it is examined by minds. Through patience, curiosity, and discipline, Aristotle transforms the natural world into a subject of understanding rather than fear. He shows that truth does not descend from the heavens, it emerges from close attention to the world around us. And in doing so, he changes how humanity seeks knowledge forever. When Aristotle is summoned to the court of Macedon, philosophy steps directly into the sphere of power. The task before him is unlike any he has faced before: to educate a young prince named Alexander the Great, the son of King Philip II. This moment quietly links two forces that rarely meet so deliberately: reason and conquest, thought and empire. Alexander is only a boy, but his energy is unmistakable. He is restless, ambitious, and fiercely curious. He dreams not of quiet contemplation, but of glory, expansion, and immortality. Aristotle recognizes this immediately. He understands that Alexander will never be a philosopher in the traditional sense, but he also sees something rare: a mind capable of absorbing ideas and applying them to action. Their lessons take place away from the noise of court, often in gardens and open spaces where conversation can flow freely. Aristotle teaches not only reading, writing, and rhetoric, but ethics, politics, science, and literature. He introduces Alexander to Homer's Iliad, presenting Achilles as both hero and warning, a model of courage shaped by honor, restraint, and purpose. For Aristotle, education is not about obedience, it is about shaping judgment. He teaches Alexander that leadership is not simply command, but responsibility. A ruler must understand justice, balance, and the nature of human societies. Aristotle emphasizes that power without wisdom becomes tyranny, while strength guided by reason can create order. These ideas sink deeply into Alexander's mind, even as his ambition continues to grow. Central to Aristotle's teaching is the belief that culture matters. He explains to Alexander that Greek culture, its language, philosophy, and systems of thought, represents a refined achievement of human reason. While this belief reflects the limitations of Aristotle's time, it profoundly shapes Alexander's worldview. As he grows into a commander, Alexander does not seek only to conquer lands, he seeks to spread Greek culture across them. Here, philosophy begins to travel with armies. When Alexander later marches across Asia, Egypt, and Persia, he carries more than weapons. He establishes cities, builds schools, and encourages learning. Greek becomes a shared language of administration and scholarship. Libraries appear where none existed before. Though Alexander's rule is often brutal, it also creates pathways for ideas to move freely across continents. In this way, Aristotle's influence extends far beyond the classroom. The relationship between teacher and student is not without tension. Aristotle values moderation, balance, and contemplation. Alexander lives for action, risk, and speed. Where Aristotle analyzes, Alexander advances. Yet, even in their differences, the imprint of education remains visible. Alexander's curiosity about geography, biology, and foreign customs reflects Aristotle's emphasis on observation and understanding. Alexander sends specimens back to Aristotle, plants, animals, and reports from distant lands. These materials feed Aristotle's scientific studies, expanding Greek knowledge of the natural world. The exchange between them becomes symbolic. The philosopher supplies ideas, the conqueror supplies experience. However, their paths eventually diverge. As Alexander's empire grows, his identity shifts. He begins to adopt customs from conquered cultures, presenting himself as a universal ruler rather than a purely Greek king. This troubles Aristotle, who believes cultural blending risks diluting reason and order. Their correspondence fades, reflecting a growing philosophical distance. Yet, history does not judge their relationship by harmony alone. Together, they represent a rare alignment of intellect and power. Aristotle shapes the mind that shapes the world. Alexander, in turn, creates the conditions for Aristotle's ideas to survive, spread, and influence generations far beyond Greece. The conquests of Alexander produced the Hellenistic world, a vast cultural network where Greek philosophy, science, and logic become foundational. In cities like Alexandria, scholars study Aristotle's works for centuries, preserving them through political collapse and cultural change. Thus, Aristotle's role as teacher becomes one of his most far-reaching contributions. He does not rule nations, he does not command armies, but through Alexander, his ideas travel farther than he ever could. Logic, ethics, scientific curiosity, and philosophical inquiry move across borders, shaping education from the Mediterranean to Asia. This chapter of Aristotle's life reveals a powerful truth. Ideas gain strength when they meet action. Though Aristotle remains cautious of power, his legacy proves that philosophy does not exist only in quiet schools. When taught to those who shape history, it becomes a force that reshapes civilizations. In teaching a conqueror, Aristotle ensures that thought itself becomes a traveler, crossing mountains, deserts, and centuries, changing the intellectual map of the world forever. When Aristotle returns to Athens after years of travel and teaching, his focus turns inward, not toward the heavens or distant lands, but toward humanity itself. Here he establishes his own school, the Lyceum, a place unlike any other in the ancient world. It is not built around static lectures, but around movement, discussion, and inquiry. Aristotle and his students walk as they think, believing that understanding grows through active engagement with ideas. At the Lyceum, Aristotle confronts life's most enduring questions. What is happiness? What does it mean to live well? How should individuals and societies be organized? His answers will shape moral and political thought for centuries to come. Central to Aristotle's ethics is the concept of eudaimonia, often translated as happiness, but more accurately understood as human flourishing. For Aristotle, happiness is not pleasure, wealth, or fame. It is a lifelong activity of living virtuously in accordance with reason. A good life is not something one possesses, it is something one practices. Virtue, Aristotle argues, is learned through habit. No one is born courageous, just, or generous. These qualities develop through repeated action and conscious choice. By doing just acts, we become just. By practicing moderation, we become balanced. Ethics, in this sense, is deeply practical. It is not about abstract rules, but about shaping character through daily decisions. Aristotle introduces the idea of the golden mean, the balance between extremes. Courage lies between recklessness and cowardice. Generosity lies between wastefulness and greed. Wisdom lies in knowing where balance exists in each situation. There is no universal formula. Moral judgment requires reason, experience, and self-awareness. This emphasis on judgment reflects Aristotle's belief in human responsibility. Unlike moral systems based on divine command or rigid law, Aristotle's ethics trust the individual's capacity for reason. Humans are not passive recipients of morality, they are active participants in shaping it. This view profoundly influences later Western ideas about personal responsibility and ethical agency. Friendship, Aristotle believes, is essential to a meaningful life. He identifies different kinds of friendship, those based on utility, pleasure, and virtue. Only the highest form, grounded in mutual respect and shared values, contributes to eudaimonia. True friends help one another grow morally. In this way, ethics extends beyond the individual and into relationships. From ethics, Aristotle moves naturally into politics. Humans, Aristotle argues, are political animals, not because they crave power, but because they achieve fulfillment within communities. A good life is impossible in isolation. Society exists not merely for survival, but for living well together. Aristotle studies constitutions, governments, and laws across the Greek world. He categorizes systems: monarchy, aristocracy, polity, democracy, and oligarchy, and examines how each can succeed or fail. No system is perfect. What matters is whether a government serves the common good rather than private interest. Once again, balance is key. Aristotle warns against extremes. Unchecked democracy can descend into chaos. Rigid oligarchy can become oppression. The healthiest political systems blend elements, creating stability through shared power and civic participation. Laws should encourage virtue, education, and responsibility among citizens. These ideas resonate powerfully with later Western political thought. Though Aristotle does not imagine modern democracy as it exists today, his emphasis on rule of law, civic duty, and mixed government influences Roman thinkers, Enlightenment philosophers, and eventually the political foundations of the United States. The belief that citizens must be educated, virtuous, and engaged echoes directly from Aristotle's vision. Importantly, Aristotle sees politics as an extension of ethics. A just society depends on the moral character of its citizens. Laws alone cannot produce virtue. Education, culture, and shared values matter more than force. This idea challenges purely authoritarian models of governance and supports the concept of self-rule grounded in reason. At the Lyceum, Aristotle brings these ideas together. Students study logic to reason clearly, ethics to live well, and politics to build just societies. Knowledge is not fragmented, it is integrated. Science explains the world, ethics guides behavior, politics organizes collective life. Each discipline supports the others. In this unified vision, Aristotle offers something timeless. He does not promise perfection. He does not deny conflict or suffering. Instead, he offers a realistic, hopeful framework. A meaningful life is possible through reason, balance, and community. Happiness is not guaranteed, but it can be cultivated. As Aristotle walks the shaded paths of the Lyceum, discussing virtue and justice with his students, he is not merely teaching philosophy, he is defining what it means to be human in a rational social world. These ideas will outlast empires. Long after Athens declines and political systems change, Aristotle's vision of ethics and civic responsibility continues to speak to societies seeking balance, to individuals seeking purpose, and nations built on the belief that reason and virtue can guide human life. In asking how we should live, Aristotle gives humanity a question and an answer that never grows old. When Aristotle died in 322 BCE, no monuments rose in his honor, no empire bore his name, and no city claimed him as its eternal symbol. Yet few minds in human history have shaped the future so profoundly. Kingdoms collapsed, religions transformed civilizations, and entire worldviews rose and fell, but Aristotle's way of thinking endured. His legacy did not depend on power or conquest. It survived because it offered humanity something far more durable, a method for understanding reality itself. In the centuries following his death, the political world Aristotle knew vanished. Classical Greece declined, and Rome rose to dominate the Mediterranean. Yet Roman scholars did not discard Aristotle, they preserved him. His works on logic, ethics, rhetoric, and natural philosophy became foundational texts for Roman education. Thinkers admired not only his conclusions, but his structure, his insistence on definitions, categories, and rational order. In a world governed by law and administration, Aristotle's emphasis on logic and systematic thinking proved indispensable. When the Western Roman Empire eventually fell, much of Europe entered a period of fragmentation. Libraries burned, institutions weakened, and literacy declined. It would have been easy for Aristotle's ideas to disappear forever. Instead, they found new life in an unexpected place, the Islamic world. From the 8th to the 13th centuries, scholars across the Middle East, Persia, and North Africa launched a massive translation movement. Greek texts were translated into Arabic, studied, debated, and expanded upon. Aristotle became known simply as the philosopher. His works on logic, physics, metaphysics, and ethics were not treated as relics, but as living frameworks for inquiry. Philosophers such as Avicenna integrated Aristotle's logic and metaphysics into medicine, psychology, and theology. Averroes, known in the West as Ibn Rushd, wrote extensive commentaries on Aristotle, defending reason as a path to truth alongside faith. Through these thinkers, Aristotle became a bridge between cultures, Greek, Islamic, and eventually European. When Aristotle's works returned to Europe through translations from Arabic and Greek, they ignited an intellectual revolution. Medieval universities began to emerge, institutions unlike anything the ancient world had known. At their core was Aristotle. His texts formed the backbone of curricula in logic, natural philosophy, ethics, and metaphysics. To study was in many ways to study Aristotle. Theologians wrestled with him. Christian thinkers initially viewed Aristotle with suspicion. His emphasis on reason and observation seemed to challenge faith-based explanations of the universe. Yet, over time, scholars recognized that Aristotle did not undermine belief, he refined thought. Figures such as Thomas Aquinas worked to reconcile Aristotle's philosophy with Christian theology, arguing that reason and faith were not enemies but partners. Aquinas' synthesis would dominate Western intellectual life for centuries. By the time Europe entered the Renaissance, Aristotle was everywhere. Artists, scientists, and philosophers either built upon his ideas or deliberately challenged them. Even when thinkers like Galileo and Newton overturned aspects of Aristotelian physics, they did so using methods Aristotle himself had championed: careful observation, logical reasoning, and systematic inquiry. His influence remained even in revision. In modern science, Aristotle is no longer followed in every conclusion, but his approach lives on. Classification, causality, hypothesis, and explanation. These are Aristotelian instincts embedded into the scientific method. Biology, in particular, owes him an enormous debt. His insistence that living beings be studied as they are, not as myths portray them, marks the birth of empirical science. In politics and ethics, Aristotle's legacy is equally enduring. Ideas about civic responsibility, mixed government, rule of law, and virtue-based citizenship echo through Enlightenment philosophy and into modern democracies. While political systems evolve, the question Aristotle posed, what kind of life allows humans to flourish together, remains central to political thought, especially in Western and American traditions. Perhaps Aristotle's greatest legacy is not any single idea, but his mindset. He refused to separate disciplines. To him, knowledge was interconnected. Ethics depended on psychology, politics depended on ethics, science depended on logic. This interdisciplinary vision defines modern education and research universities, where fields overlap, collaborate, and inform one another. Aristotle teaches humanity how to think before telling it what to think. That is why his influence survives revolutions, religious transformations, and technological change. He does not belong to one empire, one culture, or one era. He belongs to the human intellect itself. Empires rise through force. Aristotle's legacy rises through reason. More than 2,000 years after his death, Students still learn logic through his structures, scientists still rely on his principles of inquiry, and societies still debate ethics and politics using questions he first organized. In this way, Aristotle becomes something rare in history, not merely a philosopher of the past, but a permanent architect of human thought. Civilizations fade, ideas endure. And among those ideas, Aristotle's stand as some of the most indestructible ever conceived.